Hello, everyone. My name is Julio Cardona, and today I'd like to talk to you about a few things related to my personal ideology towards education and literacy. I want to tell you about some educational experiences that I've had, which have helped shape my ideology, as well as how a couple of critical readings have recently further shaped it. And lastly, I want to talk through my thoughts on the current educational landscape and what I, as an educator, hope to do to prepare my students for the world. Thank you for listening to what I have to say. So, one educational experience that I can think back on that helped shape my ideology as it pertains to education occurred in my seventh grade grammar class. It involved my English teacher, Miss Nelson. In grade 7, I wasn't a particularly strong student academically speaking. I wasn't awful either, but I had strengths and weaknesses, and English was definitely a weakness of mine. However, up to that point in seventh grade, I had never really seen my being bad at the subject as a me problem because I was an English learner. Of course, I was behind in English for the first 5 ish years living and going to school in the US. And I think that was a valid reason for me to be doing poorly relative to my peers in those earlier years in school. But I don't think that I should have been using that to excuse my poor performance in English 7 years later when I was speaking like a native speaker. So I remember struggling in this English class, scraping by with a passing grade. I was a C student, and that was okay with me. Now, one day during grammar class, Miss Nelson was going over how the class had performed on the latest exam. She was talking about how the class hadn't performed as well as she hoped, but could get there with a bit more practice. As she went over grades, saying that there were a few F's and some D's, I honestly stopped listening when she said that most of the class had scored a C, with a few B's and a handful of A's and one person who scored a perfect score. I really couldn't care less, as long as I got a passing score. So, me and my friends were being rowdy at the back of the class while Miss Nelson was talking. She called out to us, singling me out, and scolded me. Then Miss Nelson told me to stay behind after class that day. I thought she was holding me back to scold me some more, and she did, telling me that she was disappointed in me because I usually wasn't someone who would cause trouble. But then she told me something I wasn't expecting. She said I was actually the one student in class who had received the perfect score, which took me completely by surprise. But even more surprising was when she said she was extra disappointed in me because she had actually been watching me closely as I was improving a lot in her class lately. And that's more or less what I remember from that day. What really stuck with me from that day was the feeling of not wanting to disappoint Miss Nelson, of not wanting to let her high expectations of me down. Most importantly, not wanting to let myself down when I knew someone was actually paying attention to what I was doing. That's what made that moment so impactful. Part of my ideology towards education tells me that I must communicate clearly to students that I have high expectations of them. I think back on that moment when I thought, this person, Miss Nelson, had high expectations of me even when I didn't, and that made me want to prove her right. I think about all that I've heard during my time in the credential program about the importance of placing high expectations on students, and it just affirms my beliefs. Part of my ideology towards education involves communicating to students that it is okay to fail. What is not okay is to give up, because as long as one doesn't give up, failure is simply a minor setback on the road to success. That is why I feel that teachers need to create an environment where students feel comfortable failing, as this gives them the reassurance to take risks that can lead to rich learning experiences. That's the type of environment that I hope to foster in my classroom. Another educational experience that I had, which unfortunately I can't say I think back on fondly, occurred in my 8th grade science class. Mr. DeSantos was a very well liked teacher in school and was one of my favorite teachers because of his energetic and charismatic personality. He was also fairly young for a teacher, which made it pretty easy to connect with him. I remember him assigning a project to the class. I can't really recall what the project was about, but I remember it had something to do with us creating some sort of infographic in the style of a pamphlet. On the day the assignment was due, only about a third of the class turned it in, but I remember one of the girls in class who did do the assignment handing in her pamphlet to Mr. DeSantos. Then, and let me preface this by saying that this is wildly inappropriate, Mr. DeSantos goes and tells her, "You have the balls to turn this into me?" Obviously, everyone was stunned and the room went quiet. I can't remember exactly what he said next, but I do remember him saying something along the lines of, "In America, we don't want losers. If you're in America, we expect you to be a winner. If you want to be a loser, we don't want you here." And that's about the gist of what I remember from that day. This moment was so impactful for me because aside from his very inappropriate and harsh comment, I always remember disagreeing with his comments about being a loser. I had always been told that failing wasn't something to be feared. Failure was just a part of the learning process. Part of my ideology towards education involves communicating to students that it is okay to fail. What is not okay is to give up, because as long as one doesn't give up, failure is simply a minor setback on the road to success. That is why I feel that teachers need to create an environment where students feel comfortable failing, as this gives them the reassurance to take risks that can lead to rich learning experiences. That's the type of environment that I hope to foster in my classroom. But, anyways, I think that I also thought of this moment because I can't help but make a connection to what was said in one of our critical readings by Ta-Nehisi Coates. In the chapter titled Bearing the Flaming Cross in his book The Message, Coates discusses his thoughts on the importance of creating safe spaces for learning and the tendency for those who oppose their creation to overlook their own privilege. Specifically, Coates says great cannons angle towards great power, and the great privilege of great power is an incuriosity about those who lack it. That incuriosity is what afflicts the dullest critics of safe spaces and the like. But if these writers, teachers, and administrators could part with the privilege of their own ignorance, they would see that they too need safe spaces, and that, for their own sakes, they have made a safe space of nearly the entire world. Coates firmly pushes against the ideologies that silently support the white supremacist framework that much of the US education system is built on, where the default mode of operation is set by those who have historically held power and therefore gives little considerations to those that lack it. I remember the total shift in atmosphere the day before and after Mr. DeSantos' outburst. His class went from a fairly free and cheerful environment to a place where everyone felt like they had to step on eggshells to avoid attracting attention and making him angry again. The environment felt unsafe. That's why I want to do everything that I can to make my classroom an environment that is welcoming and safe. Now, let me talk about one last educational experience that I had because I think it's worth mentioning. This one is more of a lesson that stuck with me, but it pertains directly to literacy. In my senior year of high school, during a unit focused on public speaking, Miss Castro, my English teacher, had us practice speaking in front of the class at the start of every class session to build our confidence. As people began giving practice presentations, one issue became prominent. Students had a difficult time figuring out how to talk about their topics without over explaining every little facet or dumbing down what they were talking about. Then, Miss Castro, expertly, somehow made all of our doubts disappear by saying this: "If there is only one thing that you take away from this class, let it be this. Intelligence and education are two different things. Being uneducated and being unintelligent aren't the same. The difference between a person who is educated and a person who is uneducated is simply the amount of information necessary to convey the same ideas. A person who is uneducated will typically require more information than a person who is educated and already has access to some of that information." This really stuck with me. It just made so much sense. There's no need to dumb down our language or go into way too much detail, and if people need clarification, they can always just ask. And I've heard this same sentiment expressed as recently as last semester in the credential program, where a professor mentioned something along the lines of, "People are intelligent and competent, and they are competent because of their life experiences. This is one lesson that I always try to keep in mind, so it has greatly shaped my ideology of education and literacy. The way that I see it is that it is important to acknowledge people's abilities and treat them like the competent individuals that they are. To be a successful educator, I feel that educators must convey this message to students so that they themselves can become effective communicators. Again, I see a parallel between what I learned through my personal experiences and what was covered in one of our critical readings. In Ernest Morel's article, Critical English Education, where he argues for the necessity for English teachers to collectively participate in movements for educational and social justice, he says, I believe, along with cultural psychologists and activity theorists, that all people are learners and learn language and literacy as they participate in local, socially situated cultural practices, which again isn't far off to what I learned in that very valuable lesson. And since I'm already talking about this article, I also want to comment on another point made by Morel, which tackles the theory of critical literacy, where he explains how the work that he has done has shown him how academic and critical literacy development can become tools within a revolutionary process intended to challenge existing norms and disrupt existing power relations. And that, while we generally aim for the development of academic literacies in English classrooms, we must remember that these literacies are neither harmless nor neutral. Acknowledging the ideological, elusive, and rapidly shifting nature of academic literacies forces us as educators and researchers to also consider the development of critical literacies as central to our work. Here, Morel makes a strong case that I can wholeheartedly agree with about the inherent political nature of teaching literacy in America, where teachers must make a choice between remaining complacent with the status quo and perpetuating harmful ideologies, or taking a stance against power and utilizing literacies as a tool for activism and social justice. This leads me to my last topic of discussion, where I want to discuss the current educational landscape in the US. Recently, with talks about abolishing the Department of Education and an overall attitude towards becoming less tolerant towards students from marginalized communities, it feels like the stage is set for a real shakeup in education, a shakeup in a not so positive direction. I think it's an understatement to say that the state of education in the US has teachers worried. Just last week, I randomly had a special education teacher ask me if I thought we would still have a job in the next few years with the way things were going with our current government. For students, it's likely that disparities in access to quality education nationwide and the resources they have available will vary significantly going forward. And this issue will, of course, hit low income and marginalized communities the hardest. Making things worse are the lingering effects and learning loss that occurred due to the COVID 19 pandemic. A greater proportion of students and teachers report struggling with mental health challenges, which makes the need for mental health support more crucial than ever. It's honestly no wonder people are so concerned. But still, I don't feel like there's a need to despair. As a collective, educators throughout the nation are doing their part to help remedy the issues they can tackle. I know that what I can do to help combat the harm brought on by changes in policy is limited, but at least within my classroom, I'd like to help develop students' literacy so that they can be better prepared for what's out there. In my classroom, I'll be introducing them to counter narratives that go against harmful ideologies about people of color and other marginalized communities, some communities that they most likely are a part of or have contact with. I want to introduce them to texts that humanize groups that they would otherwise never see coverage of as people, but rather a homogeneous group portrayed in a negative light. I want to raise their curiosity about the things that they see and hear from people, from media, at school, and outside, and why those things are spoken about the way that they are, and who benefits from turmoil, confusion, and division among everyday people, and what they can do to fight against systems of oppression. I want to make sure that when students leave my classroom, they are well informed and wish to continue being informed by seeking out credible information. Most importantly, I want them to learn how they learn. I think that's the crux of literacy, so that they can discern what's real and what isn't, even in my absence. That's what informs my ideology towards education and literacy, and that's what I know I can definitely do to apply my ideology in my teaching.